Welcome. We're on the red couch with Julie Murphy. Julie Murphy wears many hats. She is part business executive and part yoga teacher, working in business development and social media marketing as the owner of Indaba 360, and whenever possible, spreading the joy of yoga and reminding people to breathe. She also enjoys her involvement with the 46664 Bangle Project, the bracelet bearing Nelson Mandela's prisoner number. This social entrepreneurship initiative creates employment for underprivileged people in South Africa. The bangle is a reminder of Mr. Mandela's principles, and it raises awareness of global social issues such as HIV/AIDS prevention, poverty, and education and human rights. Julie has lived and worked in Europe and was transplanted from South Africa to the United States in 2001. Julie, I am thrilled to have you on the red couch.
Happy to be here.
Thank you. I would love to know what it was like to grow up in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Well, I grew up in the 1970s, so as a very privileged white South African. And I think that a lot of what was going on around me I was fairly oblivious to. I kind of knew that things were happening because South Africa was going through various changes, but it wasn't obvious to me that we were living differently to how a lot of the rest of the world was living. So, I mean, you mentioned Nelson Mandela and the Bangle Project, and growing up in the 1970s in South Africa, Nelson Mandela was really, and his political party were really symbols of communism and even terrorism. So those were the beliefs that we were brought up with. Those messages were reinforced sometimes subtly, sometimes quite dramatically, culturally, socially, at school, through the government. The life that we were living, we thought was pretty normal. Living a segregated life didn't really have much to do with other races or cultures. And through not living and working and playing sports and going to school with those cultures, those different cultures, then really not understanding anything about them and just living in our own little bubble. Right. That's what it was like to grow up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is really the problem. When you don't grow up with someone, then that's the start of how you can develop fear about them. Or uncertainty, I guess.
Right. And even just ignorance. You just assume that the way you are living is kind of normal and you don't know what the rest of the world has a problem with.
Right.
So it's odd. It didn't feel odd then growing up in that period, but it certainly felt odd to look back on it years later and see, wow, we really lived like that. We really thought those things. So it was a very strange and beautiful time. It's lots of contradictions and lots of complexity in the country and in our people.
And you moved to, was it the United Kingdom?
I moved to the UK, and that was an eye-opener.
Yeah.
Because then it was, in South Africa, we didn't get TV as a country until the late 70s.
Wow.
So there's something about not having access to knowledge. And of course, I'm such a dinosaur, we definitely didn't have the internet in those days. So when you don't have access to knowledge and there's things going on, you see things in the newspapers and so on about international opinion about your country. But then when I left the country to go backpacking and exploring, and I hit the UK for a few years in Europe. And then my eyes were opened to, gosh, people actually do live differently. And obviously by then I knew a lot more about the international resentment towards South Africa as a country. Yeah.
Wow. So when was the turning point, or what was the turning point for you? Or was it more gradual to seeing Nelson Mandela as the person that you see him as now?
Today. It wasn't an aha, eureka moment. It really wasn't. It was very gradual. And I spent a few years in Europe, went back to South Africa, and actually went back after Nelson Mandela had been released from prison. So in 1990 he was released. And that was the year I happened to be going home. And I went home to a country that was on the verge of a lot of change. And I think that I still had changed some of my belief systems, but still politically I wasn't quite sure where things were going to go. You know, if this new government that was going to more than likely be elected, what were the democratic elections going to be like? So there was still fear and uncertainty about the future of our country, what was going to happen. And I think that over a period of time, that once Nelson Mandela was elected president, and I started to see some of his speeches on TV, not necessarily his inauguration speech, but just started watching him on TV, I started to think of him slightly differently, like, or think of the situation in South Africa differently. You must remember that we were on the cusp of complete uncertainty. Yeah. We didn't know what was going to happen to our lives. We knew our lives were going to change dramatically, but we didn't know how they were going to change. And we had no idea what was going to happen in this new country.
And what had you been told might happen?
It's not so much told, you just assumed. People were stockpiling food, leading up to the elections. We didn't know if there was going to be bloodshed and civil war.
Wow.
We didn't know if there was going to be revenge and retribution, and a lot of uncertainty. The week or two before the elections, the first democratic elections, I was coming back from the UK from a business trip. And I was probably one of about 10 people on the aircraft actually returning. The aircraft was empty because a lot of people were leaving South Africa in droves then because of the uncertainty. So I think that was the big thing, that when you don't know how something's going to turn out, and when it's fear-based, then that can, stir up a lot of emotions. So we were watching and waiting and, just trying to seeing what was going to happen. So coming back to your question about what was the turning point, it was gradual that I started to notice that there was something different about this man, something unexpected. Yeah. And I started to feel, hopefully optimistic, that more positive about, hey, maybe this is going to be all right. Maybe our country's going to be okay. Maybe there's something here that makes it more positive than I thought it was going to be.
What's amazing to me is that, here's a man who many people looked at as a terrorist, and now he's taking over the country or becoming the president, and how much fear that must have held. And then being open to seeing him as a human being, as a different person.
And that's exactly what it was like. The politics disappeared, the barriers that we're brought up with disappeared. For me, Nelson Mandela then became, in my head and the way that I think about him now is the way that probably most of the world thinks about him. His qualities as a leader, and as somebody who had many options available to him when he came into power. And he chose the path of peace and reconciliation. And that was tremendous. There are a lot of South Africans that are hugely grateful for that. And it's through actions that you learn. Maybe how you change your belief system. It's through other people's actions, through watching their behavior.
Right.
And that's how that shifted for me.
Wow.
And look, do you know the movie Invictus?
Yes.
Yes.
With Morgan Freeman?
Yes, Morgan Freeman, wonderful Morgan Freeman, portraying Nelson Mandela during the time that it was in the 1990s, post-election. Nelson Mandela was president, and it was the culmination of the World Cup Rugby. It was the final World Cup Rugby match, which was very important to South Africa. It was the first time we'd really been back into international sports. So it was a sport that we were crazy about. And I was at that final match on the last day.
Wow.
It was exactly as the movie portrays. It was as dramatic as that. But it was only, so that was 1995, and it was only when I saw the movie last year, I think it was, when it came out, that even more pieces were revealed to me, that I didn't realize just how strongly the black South Africans felt about the white South African sport, rugby. Rugby was a traditional white South African sport that people were excluded from. And I didn't realize how much hatred there was around that. And the Springbok green and yellow rugby sweater that the team wears was a symbol really of racism. I wasn't even aware of that.
Wow.
And what Nelson Mandela wanted to do around that time was use this fantastic sporting event, this magnificent coming together of New Zealand and South Africa, to bring the country together and to say, let's stop with the past, acknowledge the past, but let's use what's happening now to bring the country together. So let's forget the hatred around the sport. Let's forget the symbolism about it. Let's embrace it, and let's come together as a community that's going to support South Africa. This is about South Africa being proud to be this wonderful new nation.
Stay tuned for part 2 of this interview on the Red Couch.